Now, this concern with the origins of culture, which he displayed in such a rich way, one has to say, was all bound up with his notion that we make our values.
Yes.
Because if human values and human culture are made by us and not given to us by God or authority outside ourselves, then the whole question of how we get them, where they come from, becomes a fundamental one for him, doesn't it?
Yes.
And it's also a fundamental 19th century concern,
Yes.
the whole concern with origins.
Yes.
One thinks of the origin of species, Darwinism, and so on. Was Nietzsche influenced by Darwin?
Yes, well, he certainly was anti-Darwinian, and I think the idea is that he didn't really understand very clearly what the whole theory of the origin of the species came to. Like so many 19th century figures, he was always going to study physiology, going to study chemistry, going to study physics, but never got round to it. So I don't think that there's an awful lot of interesting things to be said about his attitude to that. But I think the main point about origins is that, again, like some philosophers, like Marx, for instance, he believes that you can determine the quality of the product by the nature and quality of the origin. This, after all, is very much what Freud did, and I suspect that Freud got it very largely from Nietzsche, although he isn't very ready to acknowledge it. Now, what that means is really that the background, the genealogy of morals, for instance, you quoted one of the titles, is in fact indicative of the quality of morals. Now, let me say, I don't believe this is true, but I mean, that is very much the 19th century view over and over again, that you can determine the quality of a mental product by the nature, by the origin that is at the back of it.
Yes, and we are now inclined sometimes to call that the genetic fallacy.
That's
but
right.
I don't want to go into that.
Yes, I think it's very close, yes.
Your mention of Freud prompts
Yes.
another question that I wanted to put to you. This program of re-evaluating values and seeing values as something that we create to meet our needs led Nietzsche to a psychological analysis of values in terms of both individual and social needs, didn't it?
That is perfectly true.
It becomes an essentially psychological
It is
inquiry.
a way of psychologizing a lot of phenomena. This is perfectly correct. And indeed, I think he was a very remarkable psychologist in many ways, and he does not produce a system either in psychology or in anything else, and in that sense he's different from Freud, but he's very, very similar, in fact very much of an antecedent to Freud, because he places a very great deal of emphasis upon the unconscious. There is a myth about to the effect that Freud invented the unconscious. Nothing could be further from the truth. The unconscious has been about since the end of the 18th century, and Nietzsche is one of those who used the term and put tremendous emphasis on it. But he does not have a layer theory of the self the way that Freud did. As I say, he is very, very much less systematic. He distrusts systems. He thinks there's something indecent about trying to encapsulate a human being, a human psyche, within a systematic account.
Another aspect of that is his notion that different moralities are appropriate for different people.
Yes.
Which he certainly had, didn't he? I mean, wouldn't it be true to say, well, in fact, you have said it, I think, that he distrusted rules. He thought they hamstrung the strong, they limited the creative.
Yes. He does believe that individual people are entitled to individual kinds of behavior and to individual bits of knowledge. This is the most astonishing thing, and also I think in many ways very prophetic kind of thing, that he believed that knowledge was not absolute, that the acquisition, the pursuit of knowledge was not to be taken absolutely, but that a given civilization had its own particular entitlement to the kind of knowledge that it could bear. You see, the emphasis is on it could bear it. He did envisage situations where knowledge would destroy the knower.
Our knowledge of nuclear fission, for example, has become a lethal threat to us.
Precisely.
And that is something that Nietzsche would very easily and very well have understood.
Yes, and he did in fact say so. I mean, not about nuclear physics, of course, but about knowledge generally. You see, we only have really one other theory of knowledge apart from our own. Our own is that all knowledge is worth pursuing regardless, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, the other one is the Soviet idea, which goes on and which simply creates a system by which knowledge is socially useful and then pursued and not pursued if it's not socially useful. Nietzsche's view is somewhat similar to this. He does believe that given civilizations can destroy themselves, and the ground on which all this is erected is, in fact, we're coming back now to Socrates, the Socratic yen for knowledge, this endless, this driving force which pushes us on.
Up to this point in our discussion, we've talked about Nietzsche's critical enterprise.
Yes.
This basic view that up to this point in our history, the morals and values and standards of Western man have all been historically based on belief in a god or in gods who gave us these values, gave us these moral standards and so on, and would judge us by our failure to live up to them or success in living up to them and so on. Now, he comes along and he says, we've lost belief in God, we've lost belief in religion. That means we've lost belief in the whole foundation of our value system. And if we're to have a valid value system, we've got to reevaluate it and refound it from the bottom up. And we've talked of some of the various critiques, individual critiques, into which this led him. I now want us to move on from this to the next stage of the discussion. And in a sense, it's the obvious question to ask. What were his positive values? Having, as it were, swept everything away on a colossal scale, what is he now advocating that we put in its place?
Well, the answer to that is a very simple and a very complicated one, both at the same time. The simple answer is be yourself at the top of everything that you are, to the hilt. Live your life fully, live it adventurously, and all the other things which later on come under the heading of élan vital, that in the human sphere, I mean, that essentially the be thou thyself is the major premise from which he begins, and also the goal towards which ethics ought to be directed. Now, you may ask, of course, if everybody is himself and himself alone, how is this to be done in a wider sphere? How is this to be done in a political system and so on? The answers to that question are, I'm afraid, very unsatisfactory as far as he's concerned, as indeed his whole attitude towards social questions never does get very far. Now, I said also that this is very, very complicated precisely for this reason, because it makes living together in some kind of harmony extremely difficult if you add to this the view that laws are, after all, there simply to make things easy for the weak person. You can see there's not very much purchase to be got out of that either. So it is, on the face of it, a simple system, but basically I think there is a great deal of difficulty facing anyone who's going to put this forward. In a sense, I think we can say that some of the fascist politics of the early part of the century is based, to some extent, among the intellectuals at any rate, on this view that you must create your own values. Well, it hasn't got us very far, as you can see.
But this notion that you must say, as he put it, say yes to life, affirm life, be untrammeled, to the top of your bent, uninhibited, also led him to the view that, of course, this is going to lead you into conflict with other people, but you must simply sweep them aside. You must sweep away the weak and the unable and all those who, as it were, get in your way. That, of course, is absolutely flat head-on in conflict with Christian morality, isn't it?
Yes, it has. But then, you see, you've only mentioned one half of it. The other part of it is you must also conquer all that is comfortable, all that is cowardly, all that is less than adventurous within yourself. And if you've done that, that is the view that he puts forward in Zarathustra, for instance, if you've done that, you won't really want to be so very aggressive towards the others. You will have some understanding of their weaknesses, though the understanding of the positive, the tolerant understanding of weaknesses is not precisely Nietzsche's very strong point.
Not what he's most famous for. I mean, people, of course, have always been shocked by his saying this, and they've thought that what he was advocating was contrary to moral standards and so on. But his point, of course, was that in fact moral standards ought to be derived from life, ought to be subordinate to life, that our notions of truth and rationality and all the rest ought to derive from life assertion. And
or from the great man.
Yes.
From the great man, and by the great man he meant, as I already mentioned, Goethe would be one, Napoleon would be another, sometimes Luther, sometimes even some of the great Borgia popes would figure as that, and sometimes even Socrates would, because he had the strength of mind to carry through his own project.